Peace be upon you, and may Allah's mercy and blessings be with you. This innocent boy posed a heartfelt question to a nun inside a church about why Jesus had to be crucified. Initially, the nun and the congregation laughed and belittled the Muslim boy. But who would have imagined that his simple and earnest inquiries would eventually guide the entire church congregation toward the truth of Islam? Let's embark on this captivating story together, hoping that those who subscribe will find their paths smoothened by Allah's grace. In a small, picturesque town nestled within Europe's tranquil landscape, a young Muslim boy named Abdul Salman was taking a leisurely walk. His eyes sparkled with innocent curiosity as he wandered through the bustling traditional marketplace filled with vendors enthusiastically offering their wares to eager tourists. Amid this lively scene, Abdul Salman noticed an elderly man with a gentle demeanor, sporting a flowing white beard and dressed in a worn brown robe, smiling warmly in his direction. In the elderly man's hands was a small, intricately carved wooden cross depicting a figure hanging with wounds on his hands and feet. "Son, you seem curious. Please take this as a gift," the old man kindly offered, extending the statue towards Salman. Without hesitation and fascinated by its peculiar appearance, Salman accepted the gift, carefully examining it with childlike amazement. To him, it appeared just as any other curious object he might find fascinating or amusing. Holding the statue firmly in his hand, Salman continued strolling through the market until he reached an ancient church whose large doors were wide open, as if inviting passers-by to enter. From inside the church, a woman's voice resonated powerfully, delivering what seemed to be a passionate sermon. Driven by his innate curiosity, Salman stepped inside without giving it a second thought. His small footsteps echoed softly on the church's cold marble floor, catching the attention of some congregants seated solemnly upon wooden benches. Their gazes followed the boy with mild curiosity. Standing proudly at the altar was Sister Betty, an older nun in her 50s, recognized for her strong convictions and strict adherence to her beliefs. Raising her hands passionately, she declared with unwavering certainty, "Jesus Christ is the only true God. He was crucified to atone for humanity's sins. Without his sacrifice, there can be no salvation. Muslims, unfortunately, worship a distant God who does not even understand love." Her words earned approving nods and murmurs of agreement from the congregation, and Sister Betty wore a triumphant smile, convinced that her faith was unquestionably correct. Salman, still standing quietly near the entrance, unconsciously tightened his grip on the cross statue. Sister Betty's words stirred something strange and uneasy within him. Gathering his courage and driven by genuine curiosity, Salman slowly moved forward, passing rows of astonished congregants until he stood clearly visible before Sister Betty. Raising the cross statue gently, he asked with pure innocence, "Sister, why did your Lord Jesus have to be crucified like this?" His voice held no challenge or malice, just genuine curiosity and innocence. Yet his sincere question drew laughter from some congregants, who dismissed it as childish ignorance. Salman, undeterred by their laughter, remained standing calmly, awaiting an answer. For Sister Betty, however, this innocent inquiry felt unexpectedly personal, like a small jab at her self-esteem. Attempting to maintain her dignity and composure, she forced a patient smile and replied, "Son, Jesus was crucified to atone for humanity's sins. That sacrifice represents the greatest form of love God could offer." Yet Salman wasn't satisfied. His gaze filled with empathy as he examined the cross. He struggled to understand how something claimed to be divine could appear so weak and helpless. The laughter from the congregation quickly faded into reflective silence, realizing the depth and sincerity behind the child's simple question. Taking a deep breath and steadying herself, Sister Betty reinforced her stance, stating firmly, "Jesus' crucifixion was part of God's divine plan. His sacrifice was necessary. Without it, our sins would remain forever unforgiven. She raised her hand decisively, emphasizing the authority of her words. But Salman, persistent in his innocence, tilted his head slightly and gently asked another profound question. So, did God have to die to forgive human sins? Could God not forgive without having to die? His innocent voice sent a shockwave through the congregation, prompting serious contemplation. Visibly shaken but attempting to hide her anxiety behind a gentle smile, Sister Betty replied patiently. Child, this sacrifice is the ultimate demonstration of God's love. Jesus died bearing humanity's sins so that we could find salvation. Salman slowly nodded, his eyes thoughtfully fixed on the figure on the cross, deeply pondering the wounds carved into the wooden statue. After a brief pause, Salman thoughtfully asked again. Then, before Jesus was born, who bore the sins of humanity? Couldn't the people who lived before Jesus be forgiven? His innocent question sparked quiet murmurs and whispers among the congregation. Some people exchanged puzzled glances, while others visibly shifted in their seats. Sister Betty was momentarily stunned but quickly composed herself and responded. God has His own ways. Before Jesus, there were laws to obey, but after Jesus came, salvation can only be achieved through Him. Salman's curious eyes met Sister Betty's firmly. But if God already had a way to forgive sins before Jesus, why did He change it later? Did God change His mind? A noticeable silence filled the church. Sister Betty furrowed her brow, clearly not expecting such profound queries from a child. The congregation, previously passive listeners, now turned their full attention to this compelling dialogue. Salman gently continued, If Jesus died as a human but remained alive as God, doesn't that mean Jesus was only pretending to die? Or perhaps there were two gods, one who died and another who lived. The entire church fell into deeper silence. The simple yet penetrating questions hung heavily in the air, causing several members of the congregation to look at one another uneasily. Trying to maintain her authority, Sister Betty lifted her chin and answered confidently. Jesus was God in human form. He died as a human but continued to live as God. Salman furrowed his brows thoughtfully, attempting to understand. So God can be dead and alive simultaneously? Isn't that like saying someone is sleeping and awake at the same time? How can that be? Several congregants began subtly nodding, showing the first signs of doubt creeping into their previously unquestioned beliefs. From the back row, an elderly man leaned toward his wife and whispered, I've never considered this before. If God died, then who was looking after the world? Sister Betty attempted to ignore the whispers growing around her and refocused her attention on Salman. With slight tension in her voice, she said, Son, this is the mystery of faith. Not everything can be fully explained by human logic. Salman, however, smiled gently, responding, But didn't God create humans with minds capable of thinking? If something doesn't make sense logically, is it truly from God? The congregation now sat completely still, deeply affected by this child's simple yet logical inquiry. Doubt began visibly emerging in their expressions. Even Sister Betty, for the first time, felt something within her wavering, a subtle anxiety creeping into her certainty. The atmosphere in the church began to feel heavy, charged with contemplation. Recognizing the seriousness of this exchange, Sister Betty gathered herself and declared firmly, God is one but has three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is the Holy Trinity. Jesus, the Son, came into the world to save humanity. Salman took a moment to ponder, observing the mixed expressions of curiosity, confusion, and doubt on the faces around him. He then asked, Sister, if God is truly one, why must there be three distinct persons? Doesn't one mean indivisible? A young man sitting in the front row murmured softly to himself. I've wondered about this too, but never received a clear answer. Feeling pressured, Sister Betty forced a patient smile. That is the divine mystery of God. We cannot fully understand it with our limited human reason. But didn't God give humans reason precisely to understand the truth? Salman pressed calmly. If something can't be logically explained, how can we be certain it is true? The whispers among the congregation increased noticeably. A middle-aged woman tightened her grip on her rosary beads, while an elderly man sighed deeply. Losing patience slightly, Sister Betty stated with greater emphasis. Son, this matter is about faith, not logic. Unfazed, Salman calmly posed another penetrating question. If Jesus is God, then who did Jesus pray to when he worshipped? Did God pray to himself? This simple yet profound question visibly startled several congregants, challenging the very core of their beliefs. Trying to remain composed, Sister Betty explained. Jesus, in his human form, prayed to the Father in heaven. Salman nodded gently. So, Jesus and the Father are two distinct persons? Growing restless, Sister Betty replied. They are different individuals, but they remain one in essence. Salman smiled innocently. How can something be different yet one at the same time? If there is a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit, doesn't that make three gods? The congregation became visibly restless, some openly exchanging troubled glances. One man whispered anxiously to his wife. I never thought about it this way before. Attempting to regain control, Sister Betty explained earnestly. The Trinity is like water. Water can exist as liquid, ice, or vapor, but it remains water. Salman gently smiled. But sister, water can't be liquid, ice, and vapor simultaneously. If God is truly one, why must there be three distinct persons at the same time? A woman in the middle row lowered her eyes thoughtfully, visibly shaken. In search of another explanation, Sister Betty cited. Jesus said in John 14 verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Thus, only through Jesus can we reach God. Salman calmly nodded, then replied respectfully. But sister, in Mark 12 verse 29, Jesus also said, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Isn't this clear evidence that God is only one, indivisible being? The entire church fell silent once more, captivated by the simple wisdom of the young boy's sincere words. Salman gently added, Didn't Jesus himself declare that there is only one God? Sister Betty faltered, struggling to find a response. From the back row, an elderly man whispered, I've read that verse so many times. Why did I never notice it before? Salman continued softly, his tone respectful yet firm. In Islam, Allah is one, either born nor does he give birth. He doesn't need to become human to understand humans. Shouldn't an all-powerful God already know the condition of his servants without needing to change form? The church grew increasingly silent. Many members bowed their heads, reflecting on the simplicity and depth of the boy's words. Sister Betty glanced around the room, silently hoping someone would speak in her defense. But the congregation seemed hesitant, shaken. Taking a deep breath, Salman added sincerely, Sister, I just want to understand. If Jesus is truly God, why did he say that he prays to the Father in heaven? Doesn't that mean he is not God himself? Sister Betty opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time, she felt utterly cornered, not by aggression, but by a child's pure and logical inquiry. The congregation exchanged uneasy glances. A growing discomfort hung in the air. A middle-aged woman leaned forward and asked in a quiet voice, Sister, is there a single verse in the Bible where Jesus directly says, I am God? Worship me? Sister Betty froze. She longed to respond, but her tongue felt heavy. Meanwhile, Salman, satisfied that he had asked what was on his heart, lowered his head in gratitude. "I didn't come to argue," he said softly. "I only wanted to understand." With gentle steps, he turned and walked out of the church. The sunlight outside greeted him warmly as he exited, his departure leaving behind a silence so profound it echoed in the hearts of all who remained. Inside, the congregation was still. The sermon that had begun with confident declarations now ended in a sea of uncertainty. Sister Betty stood frozen, cold sweat running down her neck. An elderly man at the back leaned toward his wife and murmured, "If God is one, why must there be three persons?" At the front, a young blond man raised his hand hesitantly. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Sister, I also have a question. In Matthew 27 verse 46, Jesus cried, 'Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?' Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Can God forsake himself? Murmurs spread. Others flipped hurriedly through their Bibles. Sister Betty tried to maintain her poise but felt her strength waning. With a shaking voice, she replied, "Jesus said that because he was bearing the sins of mankind. It shows his humanity and his suffering." But the young man gently shook his head. "If Jesus is God, why did he feel abandoned by God? If the Father and Jesus are truly one, how can abandonment exist between them?" Another congregant, a middle-aged woman, opened her Bible with trembling fingers and read aloud from the Gospel of John. "Jesus said, 'I am going to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God.' Sister, if Jesus is God, why did he say my God? Does God have a God?" Sister Betty felt her body grow weak. She attempted to respond. "That is Jesus showing humility in his human form." But then an old man near the altar asked solemnly, "So is Jesus human, or is he God? If he's God, why does he humble himself to another God? If he's human, why do we worship him as God?" The room once filled with conviction was now brimming with doubt. People wrung their hands, eyes wide with confusion. A young woman who had remained silent finally spoke. "Sister, is there even one verse in the Bible where Jesus directly says, 'I am God'? Worship me?" The question mirrored Salman's earlier inquiry, except now it came from within their own community. Sister Betty was stunned. Her mind searched, but her thoughts came up empty. Someone behind her whispered, "I don't remember any such verse." The tension in the room thickened. People began flipping through their Bibles desperately, searching for reassurance. A man who had served as a church administrator for over 20 years looked up in disbelief. "Have we been worshiping Jesus as God all this time without a single verse to support it?" Sister Betty felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, to reaffirm her beliefs, but her voice was lost. Outside, Salman's footsteps faded into the distance, but his words lingered like an echo in the minds of everyone present. He had never intended to debate, only to seek understanding. Yet, his innocent questions had cracked open doors long closed. Suddenly, a man stood up. "Sister, if Jesus is really God, then why does Luke 6 verse 12 say Jesus spent the night praying to God? Who did he pray to?" The man repeated with a trembling voice. "If he is God himself?" Whispers once again filled the church. Confused glances were exchanged, and some congregants lowered their heads. A young mother, holding her child tightly, looked up at Sister Betty with teary eyes. "Sister, all my life I believed Jesus is God because that's what I was taught since childhood. But after everything I've heard today, I feel afraid. Have I been worshipping the wrong thing?" Sister Betty's chest tightened. This was no longer a mere theological debate, it was a crisis of faith. She wanted to respond, to offer reassurance, but the more she searched for words, the more she felt trapped in a growing confusion. From the middle of the church, a white-haired man, one of the oldest and most devoted members, stood up. His eyes were filled with tears. "Maybe it's time we look for the real truth," he said in a voice heavy with emotion. "This church, it's not the same anymore. What once was unwavering belief is now clouded by growing doubt." The congregation that once listened silently and obediently to sermons now found themselves questioning the very foundation of their beliefs. Outside, Salman walked home slowly, unaware of the storm his innocent questions had stirred inside the church walls. The sun shone above him, casting its light as though guiding the way, not just for him, but for those now seeking clarity. Back inside the once majestic church, now filled with quiet uncertainty, Sister Betty stood motionless at the altar. Her eyes stared blankly ahead. The confident energy of her sermon had vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it seemed to weigh down every heart. A middle-aged woman who had remained silent until now suddenly broke into tears. Her trembling hands clutched her rosary tightly. "Sister," she whispered, "I'm scared. If Jesus isn't God, then who have I been praying to all these years?" From the middle row, a young priest who had attended the service finally spoke. "Sister, I've taught for years that Jesus is God. But after hearing these questions, I've realized I can't point to even one verse where Jesus clearly says I am God. Worship me." An uncomfortable hush spread. The congregation looked around, hoping someone else had an answer. Sister Betty's own confidence began to crumble. It was as if the very foundation of her lifelong faith had started to crack, not because of anger or argument, but because of the pure sincerity of a child's questions. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from outside the church. The door opened, and an old man entered. He was one of the church's founders, a respected elder. His sharp gaze swept across the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his deep voice breaking the silence. The congregation turned toward him, but no one immediately responded. The room was so still that the ticking of the wall clock could be clearly heard. The young man who had earlier asked about Scripture finally stepped forward. "Sir, we've begun to doubt. A little Muslim boy came today. He asked us questions about Jesus, honest questions. But none of us could give a clear answer." The old man furrowed his brows. "A Muslim boy?" he repeated. The young priest nodded. "His name is Salman. He didn't come to argue. He was just curious. But his questions, they've left us all confused, even Sister Betty." At this, Sister Betty slowly lifted her face. Her eyes were red with tears. The pride she once held as a nun, confident in her knowledge and beliefs, felt shattered, broken not by force, but by a child's genuine search for truth. And beneath that pain lay doubt. The old man exhaled deeply and walked toward the altar, his steps slow and deliberate. He looked into the eyes of each congregant before saying, "Has anyone here found an answer to the boy's question?" No one responded. Some lowered their heads, others bit their lips nervously. Fear mingled with the silence. Finally, the middle-aged woman who had been crying earlier spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I read my Bible again, and I couldn't find a single verse where Jesus says, 'I am God, worship me.'" The old man closed his eyes as though in prayer. Then he nodded slowly. "I've been reading the Bible longer than any of you. And she's right. The boy is right. Nowhere does Jesus explicitly say he is God." A dense silence fell over the room. A man who had been attending the church since his youth stood up. His face was wet with tears, not of sorrow, but fear. "If this is true," he asked quietly, "then what are we supposed to do?" From the back row, a woman whispered, loud enough for all to hear, Maybe it's time we start searching for the truth somewhere else. Sister Betty felt her knees weaken. Everything she had believed, everything she had preached for years, was now standing on shaky ground. Not because of rebellion, but because of a boy's innocent questions that refused to be ignored. He stared out of the church's large stained glass window, where sunlight poured in, casting gentle beams across the room. For the first time in her life, Sister Betty felt truly lost. Her beliefs, once so certain, now felt like shifting sand beneath her feet. Beside her, the old man looked at her with a gaze full of meaning and compassion. "The truth has not changed, sister," he said quietly. "What's changed is that we are finally beginning to see it." Silence once again enveloped the church. The congregation, who had arrived full of confidence, now sat with heavy hearts, burdened by questions they had never dared to ask. Outside, Salman had already walked a long distance away. He had no idea that his simple, innocent words had left such profound imprints in the hearts of people he never met. The sun above shone even brighter, as if illuminating the small, sincere steps of a child who, without realizing it, had shaken the faith of an entire church. Lessons to be learned from this story. 1. The importance of asking questions in the search for truth. This story reminds us that asking questions is not a sign of disbelief, it is part of a sincere quest for understanding. Salman, despite being a young child, did not hesitate to question things that didn't make sense to him. In our own lives, we must also have the courage to seek answers to our deepest questions, especially about our faith, so that our belief rests on solid, reasoned foundations. 2. The truth is not afraid of being questioned. Truth remains truth, even after being challenged repeatedly. But if a belief collapses just because it is questioned, then perhaps it was never firmly rooted to begin with. In this story, the congregation began to experience doubt not because of hostility, but because they realized many of the teachings they held had no explicit foundation in their own scriptures. 3. Truth is simple, not confusing. One reason Salman's words had such a profound impact was that he presented a concept of God that was clear and uncomplicated. In Islam, God is one, without partner, without children, and without the need to take human form to understand his creation. Real truth aligns with reason and does not contradict common sense. It doesn't require complex explanations to make sense. 4. Guidance comes from unexpected sources. Sometimes, the biggest transformations in our lives are triggered not by scholars, priests, or learned individuals, but by something as simple as a child's innocent question. Allah guides whom He wills, often through the most unexpected means. This story reminds us that guidance can arrive in the simplest of moments, and from the most unlikely of sources. Salman had no intention of changing hearts that day. He only sought to understand. But his pure heart and honest questions stirred something deeper in those who heard him. And in doing so, he became a means of awakening, not through argument, but through truth spoken with innocence. At the grand auditorium of the University of Toronto, the air buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of students from diverse backgrounds had gathered, their eyes filled with curiosity and excitement. Today wasn't just another academic event, it was the day of a highly anticipated debate, one that had stirred interest across campus and beyond. The spotlight was on a renowned religious scholar from the United States, Dr. Richard Evans. With over 40 years of experience in theology and comparative religion, Dr. Evans was known not just for his deep knowledge, but also for his controversial takes on Islam. At 60 years old, his commanding presence and powerful oratory had earned him international recognition and criticism. Today, he was here to speak again, this time in front of a younger, more diverse audience. But as the crowd buzzed and cameras focused on the main stage, one figure quietly drew attention, though not many realized it at first. In the front row sat a young Muslim student named Hannah Carter. Born and raised in Canada, she was in her second year of religious studies. With a reputation for brilliance and depth in Islamic thought, Hannah was not just another student, she was a sharp mind and a calm demeanor. Her light blue hijab framed a face full of calm determination. She sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the stage, but her heart was preparing for what might be the most significant moment of her university life. The event began with Dr. Evans taking the podium. His voice was deep, confident, and every sentence he spoke seemed to echo across the hall. He launched directly into his critique, stating boldly that Islamic teachings were outdated and no longer compatible with the modern world. According to him, many Islamic laws were rigid and clashed with today's values of individual freedom and progress. Some in the audience nodded in agreement. Others, especially the Muslim students, shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but still listening. Dr. Evans moved on to criticize core Islamic principles, the concept of Tawhid, the oneness of God, the status of women, and various laws which he claimed limited personal freedoms. He referenced books, Western philosophers, and academic theories, crafting an argument that, on the surface, appeared solid and persuasive. But in the middle of this sea of opinions, Hannah sat still, quietly, but firmly. She wasn't shaken. Inside, she felt the need to respond. And as soon as the Q&A session was announced, her hand rose confidently into the air. The hall fell silent. The moderator looked around, then pointed. "Yes, the student in the blue shirt. Please go ahead." Hannah stood slowly, taking a breath to steady her nerves. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained composed. She gently adjusted her hijab, then raised her head to face the room. Even Dr. Evans narrowed his eyes slightly, intrigued. "Thank you for the opportunity," Hannah began, her voice clear and composed. "I would like to respond to some of the points raised by Dr. Evans. As a Muslim, I feel there are some misunderstandings that need to be clarified, especially when Islam is discussed in academic spaces like this." A subtle shift rippled through the room. Students who had been passive listeners now leaned forward, sensing something different. Many already knew Hannah's reputation as a thoughtful and articulate student. Still, challenging someone of Dr. Evans' stature was no small feat. Dr. Evans folded his arms across his chest, then gave a small nod. "Please, I'm interested in hearing your perspective," he said, though his tone carried a slight condescension. Hannah met his gaze without flinching. "One of the biggest misconceptions about Islam," she began, "is about freedom of thought, and whether Islam supports intellectual freedom. In truth, Islam encourages critical thinking and reasoning. The Qur'an repeatedly invites people to reflect, to ponder, to use their intellect." Dr. Evans gave a slight smile. "But if that's the case, doesn't true freedom mean a person can choose anything, even if it goes against religion?" Hannah nodded calmly. "Doctor, may I ask you a question in return?" "Go ahead," he replied. "In your view," she asked, "does freedom mean that people should be allowed to do absolutely anything, with no consequences?" Dr. Evans paused, then replied, "Of course not. Every society has rules, otherwise there'd be chaos." Hannah smiled gently. "Exactly. So we agree, freedom doesn't mean a life without limits. Just like in civil law, freedom must have structure. Islam's rules are not meant to restrict, but to protect and guide human life toward balance and harmony." Around the room, some students nodded in agreement. Others jotted down notes, their expressions more thoughtful now. But Dr. Evans wasn't finished. "Well," he said, tilting his head, "I can accept that argument to some extent. But what about the rules that appear to restrict women? For example, the hijab. Isn't requiring a woman to cover herself a violation of her personal freedom?" Hannah smiled again. "That's a very interesting question, Doctor. But let me ask you, do you think a woman who chooses to wear modest clothing is not free?" Dr. Evans shrugged. If it's her choice, then I suppose it's fine. But in many places, the hijab is forced by families or culture. Hannah looked directly at him. Doctor, I was born and raised in Canada. No one ever forced me to wear the hijab. I chose it for myself, because I understand its meaning. The hijab isn't just a piece of fabric. It's a symbol of self-respect and dignity. I want people to recognize me for my intellect and character, not just my physical appearance. A few claps quietly echoed from the Muslim students in the hall. Some non-Muslim students exchanged glances, clearly reflecting on what they'd just heard. Even Dr. Evans seemed momentarily surprised. He exhaled slowly and said, I respect your choice, Hannah. But what about women in certain countries who are forced to wear the hijab? Doesn't that prove Islam is restrictive? Hannah shook her head gently. We have to make a distinction, Doctor, between Islamic teachings and cultural practices. Just because something happens in a Muslim-majority country doesn't mean it represents Islam. Sometimes, oppressive customs are rooted in politics or tradition, not in religion. Indeed. Hannah continued confidently. If there is coercion, then it's not Islam. It's human error in understanding Islam. Her voice echoed gently, yet firmly across the silent hall. In Islam, she said, there is no compulsion in religion. This has been made crystal clear in the Qur'an. Dr. Evans paused. He didn't respond right away, as if the words had caught him off guard. Hannah opened her notes and calmly read aloud. There is no compulsion in religion. The right path has become distinct from the wrong. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 256. The hall grew silent once more. Even those who had been whispering earlier now leaned in, attentive. There was a stillness in the room, as if that single verse had challenged the very core of what many assumed about Islam. Dr. Evans looked thoughtful. He didn't interrupt. It was clear the verse had landed heavily, pushing back against the narrative that Islam forces belief through fear or law. Then, unexpectedly, a hand rose from the middle of the audience. A non-Muslim student, a young man with glasses and curiosity written all over his face, asked politely, I'm not a Muslim, but I've always wondered, if Islam doesn't force belief, then why is there punishment for people who leave Islam? A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was a question many had been too hesitant to ask. But Hannah just smiled, calm and unshaken. That's a very good question, she said. And I appreciate your honesty. Let's unpack this carefully. She glanced at Dr. Evans, who now appeared more serious, sitting upright, listening closely. I'll answer this not just from an Islamic perspective, Hannah explained, but also through the lens of history and international law. This will help us understand how Islamic justice actually works. The tension rose. The auditorium, once buzzing with casual whispers, now felt like a courtroom awaiting a landmark verdict. Hannah had effectively shifted the weight of the debate onto her own shoulders, and she was handling it with grace. She continued, First, we must understand that in Islam, every legal ruling has a context, a background tied to the society and circumstances of its time. She looked directly at the student who had asked the question. When we talk about the punishment for leaving Islam, we have to ask, under what conditions does this law apply? Is it universal, or are there specific contexts in which it was implemented? Dr. Evans leaned forward slightly, arms crossed, intrigued. Please go on, he said, his tone no longer dismissive, but genuinely curious. Hannah nodded and continued. If we go back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the historical records show that apostasy wasn't simply someone changing their religion. It was often tied to political betrayal, where the individual didn't just leave Islam, but actively worked with enemy forces against the Muslim community. In those cases, the issue wasn't just spiritual, it was a matter of treason. A few gasps were heard in the audience. Students who had assumed the law was black and white now leaned forward, brows furrowed in thought. So you're saying? The same student asked again. That the punishment was about political rebellion, not belief? Exactly, Hannah replied. If someone left Islam quietly, without threatening the safety or unity of the Muslim society, then there was no punishment. Historical records even show that some individuals left the faith and were simply allowed to go, no imprisonment, no execution, no punishment, because they posed no threat. Dr. Evans seemed to pause, taking it all in. But, he said cautiously, what about modern Muslim countries? Some of them still criminalize apostasy. Isn't that part of Islamic law? Hannah looked him straight in the eye. Doctor, as I mentioned earlier, there's a critical difference between Islamic teachings and the laws of Muslim-majority governments. Not everything done in the name of Islam reflects Islam itself. Some laws are shaped by politics, culture, or historical colonial influences, not authentic Islamic jurisprudence. The debate intensified. Whispering returned, but this time it was filled with curiosity, not critique. Students were jotting down notes, visibly impressed. Then, from the back row, another hand hesitantly rose, this time from a female student. I still don't get it, she said nervously. If Islam doesn't force belief, why are some of the laws so strict, like cutting off a thief's hand? Isn't that too harsh? Hannah smiled warmly. I'm glad you asked that. It's one of the most commonly misunderstood Islamic laws. But before we judge it, let me ask you something. Do you agree that laws should have a deterrent effect? The girl nodded slowly. Yes, of course. Otherwise people would keep committing crimes. Exactly, Hannah said. In Islam, laws are meant to protect society. But, and this is important, the law of cutting off the hand is not something applied casually or without deep consideration. There are strict conditions that must be met before it can ever be enforced. Dr. Evans raised his eyebrows. Strict conditions? Such as? Hannah turned slightly to face him. First, the stolen item must be of significant value, not something trivial. Second, the act must be deliberate and malicious, not out of desperation or hunger. If someone steals food because they're starving, the punishment doesn't apply. The audience was clearly surprised. Third, she continued, there must be credible witnesses, due process, and a fair legal system. And even more importantly, Islam encourages prevention before punishment. During the Caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab, when famine struck, the punishment for theft was not enforced, because the social conditions made it unjust. The silence returned, but it was no longer tense, it was thoughtful. The student who had asked the question sat back, visibly moved. So, the punishment isn't as cruel as people say? Not at all, Hannah said firmly. Islam prioritizes justice. If implementing a law results in injustice, scholars agree that its application must be reconsidered. That's why classical Islamic scholars always emphasize context before making any legal decision. Dr. Evans leaned forward, looking more engaged than ever. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely consider that perhaps he had misunderstood some key aspects of Islamic law. Okay, he said. I can understand your explanation. Dr. Evans said slowly, but there's still something that troubles me. In Islam, someone who commits a sin like adultery is punished with whipping, or even stoning. Isn't that against human rights? Hannah took a deep breath. She knew this was one of the most sensitive topics in any discussion about Islam. But she wasn't afraid. She had come prepared, not just with knowledge, but with clarity and calm. Before I answer, she said gently, her voice calm and steady, I'd like to ask a question, to you, Dr. Evans, and to everyone here. She looked around the room, making eye contact with students scattered across the audience. Do you all agree that faithfulness in marriage is important? Most of the students nodded, and even Dr. Evans responded with a slight nod. Good, Hannah said. Now, what if someone betrays their partner in marriage, breaks that sacred bond, and causes the collapse of a family? Shouldn't there be consequences? A male student from the front row raised his hand. Well, in many countries, adultery can lead to divorce, and sometimes, legal or financial penalties. Hannah smiled. Exactly. So we agree that betrayal in a committed relationship is wrong, and even today, there are consequences for such actions. In Islam, adultery is considered one of the gravest forms of betrayal, not just a personal mistake, but a betrayal of trust, family, and social harmony. That's why it's taken seriously. She paused, letting her words settle. But, she continued, as I've said before, Islamic punishments are not applied casually or without due process. They come with extremely strict conditions. Dr. Evans narrowed his eyes, curious. What do you mean by strict conditions? Hannah looked at him directly. To convict someone of adultery under Islamic law, 4 adult witnesses must have seen the act, clearly and simultaneously. Not rumors, not suspicion. Actual eyewitnesses to the act itself. The room went quiet. Alternatively, she added, a person may confess, but even then, the confession must be made voluntarily, repeatedly, and without coercion. If there's even the slightest doubt or if someone retracts their confession, the punishment cannot be applied. The students sat in silence, digesting the gravity of what she had just explained. In other words, Hannah said, this law exists more as a deterrent than something that is meant to be implemented easily. It is rare, extremely rare, that such punishment is ever carried out. In fact, many scholars throughout history have emphasized the role of forgiveness, repentance, and due process before any penalty is considered. Dr. Evans leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath. So, you're saying Islam doesn't impose punishment arbitrarily? Exactly, Hannah replied. Islam is a balance of justice and mercy. The law is not designed to inflict harm, but to protect the family unit and preserve moral values in society. In the corner of the hall, a reporter scribbled quickly in his notebook, realizing this was more than just a campus debate. This was a public shift, a turning point in how many in the room viewed Islam. And the debate wasn't over yet. The atmosphere remained charged. Some students were whispering again, though this time the whispers weren't skeptical, they were thoughtful. Many sat frozen, processing every word Hannah had shared. Even Dr. Evans, who had been firing off questions with confidence earlier, now appeared contemplative. His eyes fixed on Hannah, as if something within him had shifted. He took a deep breath. I must admit, your explanations so far have been quite logical. You've managed to address and even dismantle many of the common misconceptions about Islam. A few students nodded in agreement, and Hannah offered a soft smile. But before she could respond, Dr. Evans continued. However, he said, his tone serious again, there's still one major question. If Islam is a religion of peace, why do we see so many wars in its history, many of them initiated by Muslims? Doesn't that contradict the concept of mercy that you keep emphasizing? Heads turned. It was a question many were wondering but hadn't dared to ask. Hannah took a deep breath. This wasn't a new question. In fact, she had been asked this before, many times. She gave a slight, knowing smile before responding. Well, before I answer, I'd like to ask the audience something, she said, glancing around the room. Do you believe war is always evil, in every situation? There was a pause. Then a student in the front row raised his hand. Not always. Sometimes war is necessary, like in World War II, when the Allies fought the Nazis to stop their oppression. Exactly, Hannah said. War is a terrible thing, no doubt. But in some cases, it becomes necessary, not for conquest or power, but to defend the innocent, uphold justice, and stop tyranny. She paused before continuing. In Islam, war has never been used as a tool to force religion on others. That is a misconception. Rather, war in Islam is only permitted in very specific circumstances, and even then, it comes with strict moral guidelines. Dr. Evans leaned in. Specific circumstances like what? Hannah replied without hesitation. Only when Muslims are attacked first. Or when people are being severely oppressed. Or when peace treaties are violated and the Muslim community is betrayed. And even in such cases there are strict rules. She held up a finger. No killing of women. No killing of children. No harming the elderly or those not involved in the fighting. No destroying crops. No burning down homes or places of worship. No killing of animals without cause. War in Islam is not an excuse for brutality. It is a last resort to restore peace. A hush fell over the hall once again. In the back, a student could be seen typing furiously on her laptop, documenting each point Hannah was making. Dr. Evans was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay. I can understand that. In certain cases, war may be a necessity." He paused, then added, "But there's one last thing I want to ask. If Islam truly values peace and compassion, why does the Qur'an contain verses about fighting disbelievers? Doesn't that contradict the mercy you speak of?" Hannah's expression didn't change. This, too, was a question she had heard many times. "I'm glad you brought that up," she said. "This is one of the most misquoted and misunderstood aspects of the Qur'an. Often people quote verses like Surah At-Tawbah, verse 5, "Kill the polytheists wherever you find them," without providing any context. Of course, if you read just that line, it sounds harsh. She paused before continuing. But if you study the historical background, you'll find that this verse was revealed during a time when the Muslim community had been betrayed. The polytheists had violated a peace treaty and attacked the Muslims. So the command to fight was not a blanket order. It was a response to specific acts of treachery and aggression. She raised another point. And the Quran is full of verses encouraging peace. For example, in Surah Al-Mumtahana, Allah says that Muslims must be kind and just to those who do not fight them or expel them from their homes. That is the actual spirit of Islam, mercy and fairness. Dr. Evans listened intently, the seriousness on his face growing with every word. Then, from the back of the hall, a quiet voice spoke up. A student who had remained silent throughout finally raised his hand. "So," he asked, "would it be fair to say that Islam is a religion that responds flexibly to social and political situations, rather than being rigid and harsh?" Hannah nodded. "Absolutely. Islam is not a rigid faith. Its rules are based on balance, between justice and mercy, between individual rights and social good. Islam is not only a spiritual path, it is also a system of life, designed to create fairness, order, and peace in society." Another wave of silence swept over the room. This time, it was a silence of awe. Many of the students now looked at Hannah differently, not just as a fellow classmate, but as someone who had challenged their assumptions and opened a door they never knew existed. Finally, Dr. Evans spoke again. "I must admit," he said softly, "I'm starting to see Islam from a very different perspective." "I agree completely," Dr. Evans said at last. "And now, I understand why so many people choose Islam as their way of life." Hannah smiled humbly. "Doctor, I'm not asking you to agree. All I ever wanted was to create a space for open and respectful discussion, a place where we can understand each other without prejudice." A ripple of applause spread gently through the hall. Even a professor seated in the back row nodded in appreciation, visibly moved. Just as it seemed the discussion had come to an end, a hand rose from the audience. It belonged to an older man. His face showed more years than the average student. His voice was deep and steady as he spoke. "I have one last question, if you don't mind," he said. Hannah turned to him and smiled kindly. "Of course." He took a breath, then asked a question that pierced through the atmosphere like a blade of sincerity. "What is the strongest reason that makes you, as a Muslim woman, so certain that Islam is the absolute truth? If you could give just one undeniable reason, What would it be? The room fell completely silent again. This time, it wasn't just curiosity. It was reverence. Everyone sensed that this was the peak of the entire debate. Even Dr. Evans sat forward, his full attention fixed on Hannah. Hannah remained calm. She didn't rush. She knew such a question couldn't be answered with rehearsed words or empty eloquence. It had to come from the heart. After a few seconds of stillness, she took a slow, deep breath and finally spoke. "The strongest reason I believe Islam is the absolute truth," she said softly, "is the Qur'an." The man who asked the question raised his eyebrows slightly. "The Qur'an?" Hannah nodded, smiling. "Yes. The Qur'an is not just a holy book for Muslims. It is a living miracle, one that speaks directly to the heart and mind of anyone willing to reflect." The room remained still. Her voice, calm and full of conviction, filled the space like a warm breeze on a cold day. The Qur'an isn't a collection of words. It's a book that answers the deepest human questions, about life, about the universe, about our purpose. And what amazes me most is that so many scientific truths found in the Qur'an were only discovered by modern science centuries later. She looked back at the man, her eyes glowing with sincerity. "But more than anything," she said, "the Qur'an changes hearts. I feel it, every time I read it. There's a light that enters my soul. A peace that fills the emptiness. It eases anxiety. It gives answers when everything else fails. I've never found that power in any other book." Dr. Evans, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "But how can you be sure," he asked, "that the Qur'an is truly from God, and not just written by a man?" Hannah gave a soft, confident smile. "If it were from a human being," she replied, "then it would have flaws. But for over 1,400 years, no one has been able to find a single contradiction in it, whether in its language, history, or scientific references. And the Qur'an itself challenges humanity. Produce even a single chapter like it, if you claim it is not from God. And yet, no one has succeeded. Not even close." Dr. Evans leaned back, his expression shifting. Hannah could see it in his eyes, not just doubt, but deep contemplation. He was truly thinking. A student at the back raised their hand and asked, "So, would you say the Qur'an is the greatest proof that Islam is the true religion?" "Yes," Hannah answered with conviction. "Because the Qur'an isn't just a book of rules. It is a miracle that invites reflection. It gives evidence. It invites questions. And it gives answers that satisfy both the mind and the heart, if we're truly willing to look." The man who had asked the question earlier seemed thoughtful, as though something within him had shifted. After a pause, he said quietly, "Thank you. Your answer makes me want to read the Qur'an more deeply." Hannah smiled warmly. "That's all I hope for. Islam isn't a religion of force. It is a truth meant for those who are sincerely seeking." A profound silence enveloped the room once more, but this time, it wasn't tension or anticipation. It was reflection. People were thinking, processing, feeling. Then, slowly, Dr. Evans stood up. All eyes turned toward him. He looked at Hannah for a long moment, his expression soft, humbled, perhaps even touched. "Hannah," he said finally, "I may not agree with every point you've made, but I must admit, you've made me see Islam differently. I've debated many people over the years, but rarely have I encountered someone who could respond with such calmness, clarity, and conviction." Hannah bowed her head respectfully. "Thank you, Doctor. I only spoke the truth that I believe in." Dr. Evans gave a faint smile. "I may not convert to Islam today, but I promise you, I will read the Qur'an from a new perspective." The room suddenly erupted in applause. The students who had once been skeptical were now looking at Hannah with admiration. Some even reached for their phones, opening up the Qur'an app to read the verses she had mentioned. One female student walked up to Hannah and whispered, "Thank you." I'm not Muslim, but after today, I really want to learn more about Islam. Would you be open to talking more sometime? Hannah's smile was warm and sincere. Of course. I'd be happy to. That day, the hall that had once been filled with tension and division had transformed into a space of dialogue, thought, and awakening. What had begun as a fierce debate became something far more beautiful, a bridge of understanding. And for Hannah, that was the greatest victory of all. Not a victory by defeating someone in argument, but a victory in opening hearts, in showing the light of Islam, not through shouting, but through truth. Because in the end, Islam isn't about winning debates. Islam is about guidance. About light. About leading hearts to peace. Dear friends, the lesson from this story is clear. Islam is not a religion that must be forced upon anyone. It is a truth that reaches those who seek it with sincerity. Let us continue to open our hearts and minds, to reflect more deeply on the meaning of life, purpose, and truth. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing you more inspiring stories.